Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. Coronation Calamities. When crowning a king or queen goes horribly wrong. One of the most memorable moments of any king or queen's reign is when they are coronated. It is supposed to be a huge celebration. However, there have been many in English and British history which have gone terribly wrong. These were believed to have brought a significant amount of shame on the people who were organising the coronation. But what happens when a king or queen's huge day goes wrong, and when has this happened throughout of history? To begin, we'll look back to the year 1066, when following the Battle of Hastings, William the Conqueror had defeated Harold Godwinson, and he was awaiting his coronation. He was the first king coronated at Westminster Abbey, and he made sure that he had guards all around the abbey, as he was worried about the protests and he feared assassination and rebellion, as the English did not want to be ruled by a Frenchman. When these guards heard shouting from the abbey, they mistook this for a riot, and they then set fire to nearby houses to distract rebels who weren't there. The entire congregation made a run for it, to help put fires out, and others also went to loot some of the houses. It was not a good start for William the Conqueror. But then in 1216, King Henry III was just 9 years old when he was coronated, but he was not given a crown. Instead, he was crowned with his mother's tiara. This was as his father, King John, had lost the real crown of the realm in a bog in Lincolnshire. But imagine that, a king being crowned without a crown. When Elizabeth I was crowned, it was a long time coming for the youngest daughter of King Henry VIII, and she was known to be someone who complained a lot. Even at her coronation, she could not help herself. And when she was being anointed, which is the most important and sacred part of the ceremony, she complained to the Archbishop of Canterbury, saying that she thought the holy oil had spoiled or gone off, as it smelt awful, according to the nose of the final Tudor queen. But in the years after the Tudor period, there were more serious problems. During Stuart King Charles II's coronation, there was a fight and a brawl during the post-coronation feast, as the royal footmen and nobles were scrapping over who got pieces of valuable cloth canopy that they wanted to keep. The knights wanted to make some money off of their royal duties. Music is also a prominent part of the coronation, and when George II was crowned, the king's wife Caroline was wearing a dress which had been covered in heavy jewels, and a pulley had to be used to lift the dress when she was required to kneel. Handel wrote the music for the ceremony, including the song Zodok the Priest, which has been performed at every ceremony since. But this was sung in the wrong place in the proceedings during George II's big day, as the choir got confused. His successor, George III, also had a bungling crowning, as the sword of state, which was meant to be handed to George during the ceremony, had become lost, and the Lord Mayor's sword had to be borrowed during the ceremony. The handling of the other royal regalia did now go well, and the king himself even had to administer a telling off and put things right. Following this was George III's coronation banquet, and during this Lord Talbot was meant to ride through Westminster Hall on horseback and pledge allegiance to George, but his horse had been trained to walk backwards, and Talbot's horse carrying him had to process through the famous buildings backwards, as it wouldn't walk towards the newly crowned king. Following George III's death, his eldest son George IV became the ruler, and he had been the regent for some time during his father's absence due to mental illness. But George spent a huge sum of money on his coronation, but it was a complete shambles. The 59-year-old George waited 11 years for this moment after being named regent, and he wanted to best his rival Napoleon's coronation. George IV's ceremony cost around £25 million in today's money, and his robe was based upon Napoleon's. But George was a very heavy man, and a large chap who, it was said, cut a disgusting figure as he entered Westminster Abbey. The spectacle got worse as George insisted that as he stepped in the abbey, Handel's Hallelujah chorus was sung, and many at this laughed. Being a larger man, The king was also sweating a huge amount during the ceremony, and he went through 19 different handkerchiefs, and when nobles swore allegiance to him, he pulled faces to those who did not like this. The coronation banquet also went wrong, as Lord Anglesey was supposed to ride up to the king's table and uncover the royal meal, but Anglesey only had one leg, and he needed 2 different artificial legs to ride and walk. But he forgot his walking leg, so he was stuck on the horse. Also, 2,000 candles that had been brought into the hall dripped wax all over the guests' fine clothes. The king's guests also fought over leftover food, and it wasn't the most savoury banquet. But George IV's most shocking moment would come when he barred his wife Caroline, who was very popular, from the ceremony. She even walked up to the entrance of the abbey, but the door was slammed in her face. After George IV's fiasco, his brother William IV tried to not have a coronation, but he was talked into it, and the ceremony was long-winded and was botched, and the Lord's Prayer was recited 3 times in the abbey, boring many of the guests. But one of the most influential queens to have ruled England, or Britain, was Victoria, the Empress of India, who during her reign expanded the British Empire. When the 19-year-old queen was crowned, she became very distressed and she was feeling rather sick. There was no proper rehearsal, and no one really understood what they meant to do or where they were meant to stand. The Queen also had to be taken back after the ceremony to complete a part of the coronation, as the Bishop of Bath and Wells accidentally turned over 2 pages of the Order of Service, missing part of it out. Victoria said the Bishop of Durham was also hopeless, and she later wrote that no one had a clue what they were doing. The Archbishop of Canterbury put the coronation ring on the wrong finger and gave her the same orb twice. There was also a mad scramble when a noble threw silver coronation medals into the congregation and fights broke out. But then, also, an 82-year-old Lord Rolfe fell down the steps whilst he was paying homage to Victoria. He was not hurt, but Victoria moved forward to stop him doing this again, and this endeared the Queen in the eyes of her subjects, showing her as kind and gracious. Also, interestingly, the newspaper The Sun printed a coronation edition which was made from gold ink, and it sold 250,000 copies. But the ink in this paper was made from brass, and it was actually poisonous, and those printers that did this had their hair stained green by the ink, and they also experienced horrible illnesses. Moving into the 20th century, you would have thought that things went a lot smoother with the coronations, as documented evidence would show how the coronation would take place. But there were still mistakes. On the 9th of August 1902, Edward VII was crowned, and no coronation had occurred for 64 years following the reign of Queen Victoria, and there were no rehearsals. The nobles involved forgot their roles and what they were to do, and there was traffic jams, and the heralds did not know their place in the procession. Also, the Archbishop of Canterbury was so frail that he took 3 times to kneel at the king's feet, and he also put the crown on the wrong way round. This also happened during King George VI's crowning. There were tests across the loudspeakers in London that occurred at 3 a.m, waking the king himself up. He wrote at breakfast that he had a sinking feeling inside, but when George got to the abbey, a priest fainted, and there was more delay. But then the Dean of Westminster tried to make George wear a coronation surplice the wrong way round, and when it was time for George to make the coronation oath, he held his thumb over the writing so that George could not see it. Also, his crown was placed on the wrong way round, and also a bishop stood on his robe, with the king almost falling over. So, throughout 1,000 years of history, there have been a number of huge problems that occurred with the coronation. Some were crowned the wrong way, and other members of the monarchy looked completely pompous during the proceedings. But it will be interesting to see in the following centuries if this sacred and important ceremony runs much smoother. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.